Francis Bacon was born one of 5 children in Dublin on the 28th of October, 1909. The son of Edward Bacon and his wife Christina, he was not of Irish blood. The family lived in and near Dublin because his father, a horse trainer, was employed there. By the late 20s, Francis Bacon had settled in London after traveling through Europe, and was making a fitful living as a designer of furniture and rugs, and as an interior decorator. In the August 1930 edition of Studio, under the heading The 1930 Look in British Decoration, is to be found a note on Bacon's work with illustrations of the furniture and rugs he designed, and of the interior of his studio. It's interesting to see that the tubular base of one of his tables bears a close resemblance to the kind of railing that encloses some of his papal and political executive figures of the 50s, and the rugs hanging on the facing wall have abstract designs. These bear at least some resemblance to the paintings he was doing at the time. It was never his intention to spend his life as an interior decorator. In the late 20s and 30s, it was difficult for unknown painters to survive. Art dealers were mainly preoccupied during the Depression with ensuring the survival of their established artists. Ever since he left home, he had been fascinated by reproductions of paintings, but his beginning as a painter dates from a visit to a Picasso exhibition in Paris in 1926. He returned to England a painter in his heart. His earliest paintings, in watercolor or gouache, although related to his designs for rugs, included elements drawn from both late Cubism and Surrealism. By the end of 1929, he had begun, however, to paint in oils such romantic subjects as dead trees in landscape. The dead trees were followed by paintings inspired by Picasso's most surrealist phase of the late 20s. But the organizers of the International Surrealist Exhibition held in London in 1936 considered his work not sufficiently surrealist for inclusion. Several of his earliest paintings are now destroyed and presented here as black and white pictures. The classification of Francis Bacon's work is sometimes confusing, due to the many triptychs and versions of the same subject. They are nonetheless presented by year and number. Bacon began to paint without having received any instruction whatsoever. Considering that such work as painting was made within a couple of months of his beginning to paint in oils, and that he was entirely untrained, and that he was no more than 23 or 24 when he made Crucifixion, it is plain that he possessed extraordinary natural talent. Even his earliest works are marked by conspicuous intelligence and an innate capacity for the actual application of paint. In 1936, he painted an abstraction from the human form, a preliminary version of the center panel of the Tate triptych. 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, which was painted 8 years later. It was while living in a city threatened with periodic death and destruction that Bacon set to work on this first major painting of his career. In the Tate triptych, Bacon incorporated the expressive distortions learned from Picasso and the violent subject matter absorbed from the Surrealists in an image that is wholly original in its shrill potency. The snarling teeth of the central figure and the wailing mouth of the one on the right establish with precision central elements of Bacon's imagery. In its illusion, the painting reaches well beyond the horror of our time to invoke not only the treachery of the crucifixion, but also the vengeful pursuit of the wicked by the Furies, who had been recast as flies 2 years earlier in Jean-Paul Sartre's play Les Mouches. While the crestfallen female of the left panel is clearly a mourner at the cross, her bestial companions defy strictly human interpretation, their barbaric and enraged forms agitating the triptych. During the years 1937 until 1944, he painted as little as one painting a year. This sterility was no doubt due mainly to the war. He served full-time in civil defense in Chelsea, but also to his disappointment about the failure of the exhibition he held in 1934. Whatever the merits of his earlier works, it is beyond question that this triptych expresses the imagination of the artist with an authority that belongs to none of its predecessors. The theme is evidently one that he had pondered long and deeply, for he took it up in 1944 exactly where he had left off the study, since destroyed, that he had made in 1936. This was followed in 1945-46 by two paintings of ever greater power, Figure Study 2, generally known as the Magdalene, which is surely one of his finest paintings. The lowered head with screaming mouth appears in a crouched figure sheltered by an umbrella. Paralleling the ribs of the umbrella above, the blade-like fronds of a tropical plant radiate beneath the chin of the figure, as though visible evidence of the piercing, vibrating sound. The second painting, Figure Study 1, is a work of comparable imaginative force, which probably just predates it. A third painting, Figure in a Landscape of 1945, is the first in which he invokes the sense of calamity that became so conspicuous a feature of his art. This picture was triggered by a pair of utterly disparate photographs. An image of Eric Hall dozing, seated backwards on a chair